My wife left me for a millionaire. 90 times richer than him. That's what I was actually worth. She had no idea. Neither did he. And when she found out, everything fell apart in one dinner. My name is Nobbs Jones. I'm 41 years old, and if you passed me on the street in Charlotte, North Carolina, you wouldn't look twice. I dress plain. I drive an old Honda with a dent in the rear bumper I never bothered to fix. Most people who know me think I'm a consultant, something vague and forgettable, the kind of job you nod at and forget by the time the conversation moves on. What they don't know is that 4 years ago I built a fintech company from a laptop in my spare bedroom, sold my stake for just over $900 million, and never told a soul outside my lawyer and my accountant. I learned a long time ago that money talks loudest when it stays quiet. My father taught me that lesson the hard way. He lost everything in his 40s chasing the image of wealth, the big house, the leased cars, the country club membership he couldn't afford, and I watched it all collapse into a foreclosure sign on our lawn when I was 16. I promised myself I'd never build a life that could be seen through a window. So I live small. I keep my kitchen plain, my clothes simple, my mornings quiet, black coffee in a chipped mug, the news on low, the market ticker open on my phone for exactly 4 minutes before I put it away and become, again, just a guy named Nobbs. My wife Abby and I have been married 9 years. She grew up poor in rural Ohio, and she's never fully let go of that hunger, that sense that comfort was always one bad month away from disappearing. I understood that about her. I thought I did, anyway. That morning, the light through our kitchen window was the flat gray of early spring, and Abby sat across from me scrolling her phone with an expression I hadn't seen on her before, somewhere between guilt and anticipation. She didn't look up when I said good morning. I didn't think much of it then. I should have. The weeks that followed felt like watching a photograph slowly develop into something I didn't recognize. Abby started wearing perfume I'd never bought her, something sharper, more expensive smelling, and she began disappearing to the gym at hours that didn't match any class schedule I'd ever seen pinned to our fridge. I told myself it was self-care. Midlife recalibration. People change their routines, I reasoned, and 9 years of marriage earns a person the benefit of the doubt. But there were smaller things too, things that only add up when you look back at them later with different eyes. The way she started angling her phone away from me at dinner, the new lingerie tags I found balled up in the bathroom trash, hidden under tissues like she'd tried to bury the evidence of an evidence she hadn't yet realized she was leaving. One evening I mentioned, casually, that she seemed happier lately. She smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes and said work had been inspiring her. I remember thinking that was an odd word to use. Abby worked in marketing for a mid-size logistics company. Inspiring wasn't a word that came up often. Then came the calls. She started taking them in the garage, door shut, voice low enough that I only caught fragments through the drywall, a laugh that sounded rehearsed, the phrase, "Not yet, give me time." I stood in the kitchen once with a glass of water halfway to my mouth, listening, telling myself I was being paranoid, that trust was something you extended even when your gut whispered otherwise. Abby's history made me generous with my doubts. She'd grown up watching her mother count coupons at the register while other kids' mothers didn't flinch at the total. She'd told me once, early in our relationship, that she never wanted to feel small again. I thought I understood what she meant. I thought building a quiet, stable life together was the answer to that fear. I didn't yet understand that for Abby, quiet and small had started to look like the same thing. The receipt fell out of her jacket pocket when I picked it up off the chair to hang it in the closet. A hotel downtown, a date 2 weeks earlier, a charge for a suite that cost more than our monthly mortgage. I stood there holding it for a long moment, feeling something cold settle into my chest. When I asked her about it that night, gently, without accusation, she said it was a work retreat, a last-minute thing, nothing worth mentioning. Her explanation came too fast, too smooth, like she'd rehearsed it in the mirror. I wanted to believe her. Believing her was easier. But something in me, maybe the same instinct that told me to sell my company quietly instead of chasing headlines, told me to follow the thread instead of looking away. 2 nights later I told her I had a late meeting and instead sat in my car across from her office, watching. At 6:40 she came out, got into her car, and drove not home but toward uptown, toward the cluster of glass towers that catch the last light of evening and throw it back gold. I followed at a distance, hands tight on the wheel, feeling like a stranger in my own life. She parked outside a high-rise I recognized from magazine spreads, the kind of building with a name instead of an address. A black Tesla pulled up. A man stepped out, tall, tailored, the kind of confidence that comes from never once worrying about the price of anything. Abby practically ran to him. He caught her like it was choreographed. Rain had started, fine and cold, streaking my windshield until they blurred into a single dark shape pressed together under the building's awning. I sat there a long time after they disappeared inside. When I finally drove home, I ran his face through a search on my phone at a red light. Preston Cade. Real estate. Forbes. Charlotte's most eligible bachelor, some article called him. I didn't sleep that night.
Preston Cade, it turned out, was not a hard man to research. He'd built his real estate empire out of aggressive acquisitions and even more aggressive self-promotion. Glass towers with his name etched into the lobby marble, magazine profiles that always mentioned his watch collection before his business philosophy. He was the kind of wealthy that announced itself in every room he entered. I sat at my kitchen table scrolling through photo after photo of his life. Yacht weekends, gala appearances, a rotating cast of women on his arm before Abby's name started appearing in captions I found through a slow, methodical search I hated myself for doing. What struck me wasn't the money. It was how completely Abby had begun rewriting herself around his world. Her Instagram, which used to be quiet photos of our dog and weekend hikes, had transformed over 2 months into curated shots of cocktail dresses and rooftop views I didn't recognize. New friends appeared in her comments, women with lifestyles that orbited people like Preston. She'd started using phrases I'd never heard her use: elevated, curated, next level. I realized I was watching someone shed a life in real time, one small revision at a time, and I hadn't noticed because I'd been too busy trusting the shape of the life I thought we were building together. That Thursday, she came home early. I was at the counter making dinner, chopping vegetables with a kind of forced normalcy, when she set her purse down and said she wanted a divorce. No preamble. No trembling voice. Just the sentence, flat and final, like she'd practiced it in her car before walking in. I put the knife down slowly. Somewhere in the back of my mind, quiet beneath the shock, I registered that she still had no idea what she was about to walk away from, and some part of me, the part still capable of dark humor even then, almost laughed. I asked her, once the initial shock cleared enough for me to speak, if there was someone else. She didn't deny it. She said his name like it was a title, Preston, and told me he made her feel like her life had finally started. She said I was comfortable, but small. That word again. Small. I thought of her mother counting change at a register, of the fear Abby had carried since childhood that comfort was just poverty wearing a nicer coat, and I understood. In that moment, that nothing I had built, the stability, the quiet security, the fortune she didn't even know existed, had ever registered to her as enough, because she'd never actually seen it. I had hidden it too well. My father's ghost stood behind every choice I'd made to live small, and now that same instinct had cost me the one person I thought understood me. She packed a suitcase that night with a kind of methodical calm that unsettled me more than tears would have. Folding shirts, rolling belts, checking drawers twice. I sat on the edge of the bed and watched her erase herself from our house one item at a time, and I said nothing, because there was nothing left to negotiate. At the door, suitcase in hand, she paused and looked at me with something almost like pity. "You'll never understand a life like his," she said. "You never wanted more than this." She gestured at the house, at me, at the whole quiet architecture of the life I'd built to protect us both from ruin. Then she left, and the door clicked shut behind her with a sound so small it didn't match the size of what had just happened. I sat alone in the dark for a long time afterward, and somewhere underneath the grief, a colder, steadier thought began to form, one that had nothing to do with revenge, and everything to do with the truth she was about to discover on her own. Word travels fast in a city the size of Charlotte, especially among people who know each other through gyms and galas and the kind of dinner parties I'd never been invited to. Within weeks, Photos surfaced. Abby on Preston's arm at some downtown fundraiser, dressed in something that cost more than our old car, smiling in a way I hadn't seen directed at me in years. Mutual friends accidentally tagged me in the posts, the way people do when cruelty wears the mask of thoughtlessness. My coworkers, the ones who thought I was a mid-level consultant scraping by, looked at me with a pity that stung more than I expected. One of them, a well-meaning guy named Tony, actually told me not to worry, that money isn't everything, as if he were letting me down easy about a truth he assumed I already understood. I almost laughed. I hadn't told anyone at work what my old company had sold for. I hadn't told anyone, period, outside my lawyer and my accountant, a decision that suddenly felt less like humility and more like armor. That week, the divorce paperwork arrived through Abby's lawyer, a request so modest, so carelessly drafted, that it was clear she had no idea what she was walking away from. She wanted the car, some furniture, a number that wouldn't have covered Preston's monthly building maintenance fees. I sat at my kitchen table that night with the papers spread in front of me, the same table where she'd once told me I was small, and felt something shift inside me. Not rage, not yet, but a kind of quiet clarity. My father's collapse had taught me to hide my wealth like a wound. But watching Abby build a new life on the assumption that I had nothing worth noticing, I understood that my silence had become its own kind of trap, one that was about to spring shut in a way neither she nor Preston could see coming. I didn't reply to the papers that week. I let them sit. I wanted to see how the story unfolded first. Abby moved into Preston's penthouse within the month, and from what I heard through the same mutual friends who couldn't resist keeping me updated, she'd fully adopted the role, hosting small dinners, posting photos from his balcony at golden hour, telling anyone who'd listen that she'd finally leveled up. At one of those dinners, a woman named Priya, someone Abby had known casually for years, made an offhand joke about wanting to toast to trading up and pulled out her phone to look up my old company for a laugh, expecting to find nothing, expecting the joke to land on emptiness. Priya used to work in fintech herself, years back, before switching to consulting, and she still had instincts for names buried in filings. What she found instead of nothing was a redacted founder listing on an old acquisition filing, a name that matched mine exactly, attached to a sale figure with 9 digits before the decimal. She told me later that she sat frozen at that table for almost a full minute, phone glowing in her lap, while the dinner conversation moved on around her like she was underwater. She didn't say anything that night. She told me she needed time to be sure, to cross-reference, to convince herself she wasn't wrong, because saying something like that out loud and being mistaken would have been its own kind of catastrophe. But she also admitted, when we spoke weeks later, that some smaller, more complicated feeling had kept her quiet too, a discomfort at how easily Abby had discarded me, and a curiosity about what would happen once the truth surfaced on its own. She sat on the information for nearly 2 weeks, watching Abby parade her new life through every channel available, holding a secret that would detonate the whole arrangement the moment she chose to let it go. I didn't know any of this was happening. I was still sitting with my own quiet, still deciding what kind of man I wanted to be on the other side of this. Priya finally told her at a dinner meant to showcase Preston's newest acquisition, a converted warehouse district he was calling his legacy project. Abby laughed it off at first, the way people laugh at things too large to process immediately, waving her hand and saying Priya must be confused, that Nobbs was a consultant, that consultants don't sell companies for 9 figures. But Priya, methodical as ever, had brought printouts, screenshots, an old press release with my name buried 3 paragraphs down, a filing with numbers that didn't leave room for confusion. Abby's laughter died somewhere in her throat. I wasn't there, but she told me later, in a different conversation entirely, that the restaurant noise seemed to fade into something distant and underwater, that she read the numbers 4 times because her brain refused to process them the first 3. 90 times. That was the figure someone at the table eventually calculated, comparing what I'd walked away with against Preston's much-publicized, much-leveraged net worth. 90 times more than the man she'd left me for. She excused herself from the table, hands shaking, and called me from the restaurant bathroom, her voice cracking in a way I hadn't heard since her father's funeral years earlier. I let it ring. I watched my phone light up with her name, a name that used to mean home, and I let it go to voicemail, then again, then a third time. I wasn't punishing her, not exactly, not yet. I simply didn't know what I would say if I answered. And I've learned that silence, held carefully, tells you more about a person than any conversation could. She texted after the third call, a single line, "We need to talk. Please." I set the phone face down on my counter and stood there for a long time in the quiet of my kitchen, the same kitchen where she'd once called me small, and felt the strange, hollow weight of being right about something I'd never wanted to be right about. She showed up at my house 2 days later without calling first, standing on my porch in the fading evening light with an expression I'd never seen on her, something between desperation and rehearsal, like she'd practiced this apology in the mirror the same way she'd once practiced the divorce announcement. She said she'd always seen something special in me, that she'd been scared, that Preston's world had blinded her to what really mattered. I let her talk. I didn't interrupt because there was a strange, clarifying power in simply listening without needing to respond. Midway through her second attempt at an apology, headlights swept across my driveway, Preston's car, uninvited, pulling in behind hers. He got out adjusting his jacket, trying to project the same easy confidence I'd seen in his photos, though up close there was a tightness around his eyes that hadn't made it into any magazine spread. He extended a hand and said something about handling this man-to-man, like we were negotiating a merger instead of standing in the wreckage of my marriage. What he didn't know, what my legal team had quietly discovered 3 weeks earlier while doing routine diligence on unrelated deals, was that his flagship building, the one anchoring his entire public image, was carrying debt levels that made the whole empire more theater than substance. I told him, calmly, that I already owned the mortgage on that building, purchased through a holding company 2 months before Abby had even left me, back when I was simply diversifying, long before any of this became personal. His face changed in a way that told me everything I needed to know about how thin his foundation actually was. Abby stood between us in the driveway, headlights cutting hard shadows across all our faces, looking between the two of us like she was only now understanding the actual difference in what we each represented. I declined Abby's attempt at reconciliation that night, not with anger, but with a calm that surprised even me. Some decisions don't require raised voices. I told her the truth, that trust, once it collapses that completely, doesn't rebuild itself just because the math changed. I finalized the divorce on my own terms in the weeks that followed, and instead of fighting over the settlement, I let her have what she'd originally asked for and quietly redirected the rest into a scholarship fund I named after my father, the man whose collapse had taught me everything I knew about hiding wealth and, eventually, about using it with intention instead of fear. Preston's empire began unraveling publicly within the year, his leveraged towers exposed one filing at a time, his image dismantled by the same media that had once built it up. Abby stayed with him through the first wave of bad press, then didn't. I heard about it the way I heard about everything now, secondhand, through people who still couldn't resist keeping me updated on a story that no longer had much room for me in it. I stood on my rooftop one morning not long after the divorce was finalized, coffee in hand, the Charlotte skyline catching that same flat gray light from the morning this all began. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something quieter than that, a kind of settled clarity, the sense of a man who'd finally stopped hiding not out of shame, but because he no longer needed to prove anything to anyone, least of all himself. My phone buzzed as the sun cleared the buildings. A text from Priya, the woman whose quiet discovery had unraveled the whole thing without her ever intending to. Coffee sometime? I think I owe you an explanation. I looked at the message for a long moment before I smiled, just slightly, and typed back a single word. Sure. Some stories end where they started. Others I was beginning to understand only look that way. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, like, and share for more interesting stories.